I'm going to share screen. And I'm going to share this. And now I'm going to go to play from current. Okay, so I hope you're seeing a map.
We are.
Okay, very good. So this is from the New York Times. I just thought I'd start off since we all love maps. And this shows very clearly the areas that the Russians have, the Ukrainians have recaptured in blue. And you can see it's almost equal to now the area that the Russians are maintaining after the fall of Kherson. So that's interesting. And then this is a close-up map of Kherson and the bridges that we've talked about. Jim told us that these bridges have been blown up by the Russians after their retreat. This is a nice picture of the dam and that they keep talking about the Russians may blow up and flood the zone. We'll see. So I just thought I'd present those maps. So now I'm going to start our history of Crimea. We're going to start off with Kherson. But I want to start off with this German princess. And as soon as anybody can blurt out why I'm starting with this German princess, just sing out or raise your hand. You know, we've all learned to use the reaction buttons, right? So this is Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a obscure small little dukedom in Prussia. Princess Sophie Friedricha Augusta von Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg. Anybody know where I'm going with this? And this is
you got a hand there.
her second hand up.
Yeah.
Okay. Harold.
Harold, yeah, but your sound.
Yeah, I turned my sound back on. I think we're going towards Catherine the Great.
There you go. So this is Catherine the Great, eventual, and her second cousin, Charles Peter. And their marriage is going to be consequential because Peter at the time is a prospective inheritor of the Russian crown. And in fact, that happens, and he becomes Peter the Third, and she becomes eventually Catherine the Second. And because we're dealing with an empire, it's not king and queen, it's emperor and empress. But here's the thing. Who set this up? Who matchmaked? It was Frederick the Great. Frederick the Great. And why am I pointing out early on that Frederick the Great had an interest in getting a friend on the Russian throne? They call him great because he was great at the management of diplomacy. And he got Peter the Third on the throne, but Catherine hated him and thought he was a fool. He'd had a checkered past. We won't go into it, but this is the payoff for all his matchmaking. Here's Frederick the Great. They're looking at a map of what? Poland. Because the three emperors of Prussia and Austro-Hungary and Russia are going to divide up Poland and take it off the map. So Frederick the Great was pulling the strings early on when Catherine was but a teenager. And that's why they call him the Great. All right, so now we're in the Kherson. We finally made it to Kherson. And this guy, Potemkin, who became Catherine's lover after Peter died. And Peter III died somewhat mysteriously after only being 6 months on the throne. We could spend a whole hour diving into the conspiracies around that. But Gregory Potemkin, in fact, became the co-ruler with Catherine. And Bob O. Oxenborough did a dive on Kherson, and he pointed out what Catherine's interest in Kherson was and why it's called Kherson. It was a new settlement, and she gave the task to Potemkin to bring this city into being. And Kherson is named after a Greek city colony in Crimea. And it's interesting, the evolution of the city 100 years later, it is multicultural. In addition to 20% Ukrainian, it was 30% Jewish. So go figure. Now, going back, Catherine the Great had a fascination with classical Greece. And she, if you've read your Greek myths, you read Jason Search for the Golden Fleece, and you learn that Jason goes to Colchis in the Black Sea. That the Black Sea is very much a part of the Greek civilization. And here's Colchis, where current Georgia is. And here is Cape Jason. And here is the Crimea. And so there's we're then not surprised to hear that the forerunner of Kherson was situated on the shores of Crimea. And Timothy Snyder goes out of the way to point out how the Greek influence in classical times in Crimea. So there's that. And there's the ruins of the city in Crimea, from which Kherson takes its name. And Snyder points out Catherine planted olive trees in a single apricot tree, and she added the southern parts of a Ukrainian region like Crimea that had never before been part of Russia, never before. And the problem for the Russians in the southern Ukraine had been the Cossacks. And if you think of Cossacks and you want to relate it to our history, these guys are rough and ready, like a Minutemen. Who are ready to fight at a minute's notice. They don't necessarily have a standing army, but they're very good at mobilizing very quickly. They're hardy horsemen, and we'll encounter them again. But Catherine and Potemkin needed to overcome their influence. And she also needed to overcome the Tatars. And so we're going to go back in history to the beginning of the Tatars. So here we are, Potemkin himself. And here's the interesting thing that Jim Teisel sent around early, that as the fate of Kherson was being sealed, the Russians, while they were still in control of the city, went to Potemkin's grave in a cathedral in Kherson and exhumed his bones. And they took him back to Russia, quote unquote, where he belongs. And this was the crypt from which they took Potemkin's bones. So, you know, in our sessions, we're always looking for current events driven history. And I think this is an example par excellence. You got to understand who Potemkin was and the fate and who that obscure German princess was. This is before the heroic Greek-like statue of Potemkin in Kherson, and here's after. They took a statue with them. So the bones, the statue, gone. Now here is what Catherine and Potemkin achieved. This was all Cossack controlled. Now there was an alliance between the Cossacks and the Russians, but the Cossacks had autonomy over this region. And you'll know that this is the delta of the Dnieper. They also, their culture also controlled the delta of the Volga as well. And these are being deltas are wetlands. So these Cossacks learned how to live off wetlands, but they weren't very good at farming. And the interesting thing at one point was Catherine gave up and said, hey, these delta lands are great. We should get somebody that knows how to drain swamps. And she recruited Germans who had from areas that had recently been war torn. And her recruiter said, if you want to start anew and head east, just like our pioneers headed west, we've got just the place for you. And they were known as the Volga Germans. They came to the wetlands of both the Dnieper and the Volga, but because the Volga wetlands were bigger, they were known as the Volga Germans. And just as a brief tangent, I have slides, but I decided not to put them in today because I don't want to slow us down that much. But just quickly, the Volga Germans were there for a century and drained the wetlands and turned them into productive agricultural areas. But then the Cossacks and other Russian farmers got jealous because Catherine had recruited them with incentives. They didn't have to serve in the army. They didn't have to pay taxes, and they didn't have to specifically pay taxes on brewing alcohol. Jim.
I hope a couple of questions. One is, so the Cossacks occupied what is being called New Russia on this map. Was there a country as such?
Yes.
The Cossacks called themselves?
Yes. So what I'm going to do, and be patient with me, I'm going backwards in history first, and then I'm coming forward again, focusing on the
Okay.
Tatars.
And
Okay, so I'm going back, and
so the Cossacks precede the Tatars,
the Cossacks precede who?
the Tatars.
I think they were about simultaneous.
And the difference between the Cossacks and the Tatars.
The Cossacks are Russians, and the Tatars are Turkic. And I'll show you. They're from the steppes. You know, this gets confusing because technically the Ukraine is on the steppes, but we'll say the classical steppes. I have some maps. This will become clear.
I would be careful to call the Cossacks Russians then, because you're trying to.
John, this is Harold.
Yeah.
What your arrow is pointing to, or the Donbass is, that's the River Don. The Volga drains into the Caspian.
Yeah, no, I'm not showing the Volga.
Yeah.
I'll show the geography of this, and just this is the Dnieper.
Yeah, that's the Dnieper, and then next to it is the Don. The Aral Sea, that's the Don River that runs into the Aral Sea.
The Don up here. But the blue thing is the Dnieper, and I'll show a map in a few minutes that'll show all these rivers and the Volga.
Can I finish my rejoinder?
Yes.
You called the Cossacks Russians, and I think you're trying to say they preceded Catherine the Great coming into that area, so they should not be called Russians, should they?
Okay, I'll accept any alternatives you come up with as we go.
Well, I don't know what they're called, but you said they occupied this area.
Okay, maybe this will become clear as I go along, and I'll think of a better answer.
Okay.
So it was Potemkin who explored Crimea and pushed Catherine and said, you know, the Tatars, the Crimeans, they will happily submit to Russian rule. Sound familiar? Somebody told Putin that the Ukrainians would happily submit. So it was formally annexed in 1783. So a model for Putin. He probably was trying to channel Catherine and Potemkin. And that's why he was so eager to get the bones back. So the Wikipedia says that the Tatars did not resist the annexation, and a lot of them left and fled to Anatolia, which was Ottoman territory.
The Tatars are Muslims, aren't they?
Yes. And so and that's the other differentiation between Cossacks and Tatars is the religion. So Snyder points out this 2,000-year Greek presence, and Catherine used that rationale that she was just reviving a renaissance of Greek civilization to suppress both the Cossacks and the Tatars. He makes the point that not only is Kherson a Greek name, but so is this familiar name to us all now of Mariupol, the destroyed city. And then there was this irony that she took actual Greeks that lived in the Crimea and forced them, deported them to New Russia, almost as if they were becoming reenactors in a theme park. And the further irony is a lot of these Greeks in Mariupol were killed in 2022, this year of our Lord.
Excuse me, did they intentionally go after the Greeks, or
No,
it just happened?
just having a lot of people died. And that I don't, if Snyder gave statistics, I've forgotten them. All right, so the point I want to make as I travel backward in history is that the Crimea was under the control of the Tatars for almost 400 years. 400 years. So to claim that Crimea has always been Russian is doesn't tally. And before those 400 years of straight control, another Altaic tribe, and when I say Altaic, I'm combining Turks and Mongols. It's a loose definition, but they're not Indo-European. That's the thing. And so the Mongols controlled Crimea for 200 years before that. And then between the classical time and the Mongols was just an era of crossroads, just a lot of sorting out. There's no one dominant culture. So let's look at that crossroads period.
Excuse me.
Yes, Aiko.
So the Tatars are just north of where the what is that group? They're north though, right? So how did they come under the Russian control? What time did they come under Russian control?
Well, I'm going backwards in history. So with Potemkin.
The Tatars came under Russian control. Potemkin.
Yeah,
So late.
with Potemkin, yeah. I hope it's not confusing that I'm in reverse gear. One of during the crossroads period, in Putin's mind, one of the epic moments was when Vladimir the Great was baptized. So now we're back to 988. We're before the Mongols now, going backwards. And the what Putin believes is that Vladimir the Great was baptized in Crimea. And there's a church here, Saint Vladimir, that asserts that this was where Vladimir the Great was buried. Snyder says there's no evidence that this is where it's possible, but there's no evidence. And if he was baptized here in the year 988, this part was controlled by the Byzantine Empire, which you could say was a Greek, and so if maybe the Greeks still own Crimea and they deserve it, by using this logic of baptism as being the thing. The consequence of Vladimir the Great being baptized is he went back to Kiev. He was by that time the king of Kiev, and said, hey, everybody into the Dnieper, everybody's going to be baptized. And they bought this fellow from Constantinople. And by the way, the reason that Vladimir chose the Byzantine Orthodox religion, the other contenders were at the time Islam and Church of Rome. The reason that he chose what was the splendor of Constantinople, particularly Hagia Sophia, the great cathedral there. And so he didn't want to do Islam because you couldn't drink in Islam. And he thought that Rome was too far down in its evolution. So the Ukrainians, during a period of nationalism in 1853, claimed Vladimir as their own, way before the Russians did, and put up a statue of him overlooking the place of baptism. Snyder says, actually, it's quite possible Vladimir was baptized here, overlooking this spot. By the way, Putin put up his competing statue of Vladimir, claiming him as a Russian, in 2016 outside the Kremlin. I think I showed that earlier in a previous lecture. So we're continuing to go back in time, and we're going to go back 100 years when the Tsars started the clock ticking on Russian history. And they started their clock with the arrival of the Vikings. Vladimir was a Viking. And the Vikings started down the waterways that lead to the Dnieper, going right by Kiev, around 850. Their first big stop was Novgorod. And Novgorod is interesting. And this date, 862, is going to loom large in just a second. Just remember, Novgorod, 862. They finally moved down to Kiev 25 years later or so. And the Vikings have come in an area that's just politically disorganized. The Slavs, for whatever reason, never could put together a large polity. They couldn't agree on a leader, and it's reported that they begged the Vikings, please organize us. Please, we need somebody to police this area. It's just one warlord after another. And so the Vikings, if you will, imposed some kind of order, as they did in eventually England, the Normans. They came from France, where they'd been the people of the north, the Norsemen. And they were given Normandy as a bribe to keep them out of Paris. And they eventually got down to the Mediterranean as well. And that's a whole interesting story, getting all the way to Sicily. But our story is here in Kiev, and going backwards in history now, we're at 862, and the Tsars decided that 862 was a good date because it was 1862, and they wanted to celebrate. They wanted to celebrate their closure of the steppes, the conquest of the steppes. Since time immemorial, these steppe tribesmen had rolled down from the steppes and raided civilization after civilization, starting with probably Sumeria. And so as we've said many times, history doesn't matter as much as what people believe. And the Tsars decided to believe that the clock started with the arrival of Rurik the Dane. And here he is in they have this tremendous millennium statue with all the great characters of Russian history. And I've drawn from it, and you'll see statues from this millennial sculpture that the Tsars mobilized all their wealth to build it. So we're going backwards. And who did the Vikings have to defeat? Now, this is interesting. Around 860, they had to push the Khazars out of Kiev. And who were the Khazars? They had a cognate. All these fancy words for warlords. So if you're a successful enough warlord and you can establish and pass on all the stuff you've conquered to your son, you've started a dynasty and you're no longer a warlord, you get to be a cognate or a khanate. There's a million different words for successful warlord dynasties, and it just confuses history as long as we remember that their legitimacy comes from violence. And the Khazars, for those of you who are Jewish, you're going to find the Khazars fascinating. So the Khazars had the best control within the solid blue area, and that encompasses Kiev. It encompasses most of Crimea, but there's a little exception to Crimea. We'll always see Crimea has little exceptions on the coast, but their sphere of influence was larger. The story of the Khazars. Kiev became a center of Judaism from this period. And they chose what religion they wanted in the same way Vladimir had. And maybe Vladimir was copying them, trying to choose between the three candidates: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. They had a sky god, Tengri, but they aspired, if we're going to be a power in this area, we need a world religion. And there's a report, this is verbatim: the Jews are urging us to accept them, while the Arabs are promising us peace. So we can understand from that the Arabs were very aggressive. And then we see where the Khazars are. They're just north of the Arab spheres of influence. But the Constantinople sent Cyril himself, the guy that did the alphabet, as part of his missionary work. And he was coming to the Khazar capital, and he stopped along the way to debate with Jews so he could familiarize himself with the Torah and win the debate in front of the Khazar king. Cyril, in fact, won the actual debate, but the decision was made in a very interesting way. It was kind of like ranked choice voting. So bear with me. He had in the back of his mind that he liked Judaism, but what he did was he bought in the Christians, and he said, "Okay, I understand your point of view, but who should be in second place?" And the Christians said, "Well, of the two remaining, Islam is certainly worse than Judaism." And he did the he did the opposite with the Muslims, and they said Judaism was less bad than Christianity. So in using ranked choice voting, he meant the conclusion, both of everybody said that the religion of Israelites is better. So he thus chose Judaism. A real politician would say, well, that was convenient because he could declare independence from rule of both the regional powers, which were Byzantium and the Caliphate. And so the Khazars came up with coinage, and on their coins, instead of Muhammad's the messenger of God, it was Moses is the messenger of God. So Frankopan gives a map from that time. He puts the Khazars, they're starting out a little bit further east than the maps that we've had so far show. But they were contending with Magyars, Hungarians, to the west. And you can see, I like this map because it shows trade and ways of getting around and influence. All right, so we're back now to about 650, and that's when Snyder declares that the Crimea belongs to the classical world. And reaffirms, as we said, that the Greeks had been there. So now I'm going to reverse gears and put it into forward gear, and we're going to focus on the Tatars and their longest dominion in the Crimea, and how did they get there?
10 minutes still.
We started late though. So they're Turkic. They were considered the indigenous people of the Tauric Peninsula. It's just another word for Crimea. Don't be confused. And the Tatars were a creation that came into being between the 13th and 17th century. They're a combination of an original steppe people, the Cumans, and they appeared from the steppes in the 10th century. And there was a mixed pot of the Cumans and the original people that we've talked about, the classical people. And from that emerged a mestizo culture, the Tatars, ethnogenesis. It's nice to hear of ethnogenesis instead of ethnic destruction these days. So Crimea has always been and can be thought of as a boundary between this classical world and the steppes. And just emphasizing here that some of these early trading cities that came to Crimea is Genoa. And this is significant in medieval times because it was the boats of Genoa that carried the Black Plague from the Silk Road to Europe. There is always a changing cast of the steppe nomads until the Russians subdue the steppes in 1862. And that is a significant accomplishment, whether it's good or bad. The people in the stands have varying opinions, especially these days when Kazakhstan is alarmed at what Russia is doing in Ukraine. In the 14th century, they didn't resist the Mongols as much as they collaborated with them, thus their staying power. And when the Mongols faded, it was the Crimean Khanate, again, that word, the Crimean warlords that emerged until they were conquered eventually by the Ottomans and became a dependency. So this is the map I was promising you, Jim. So and Harold, the Dnieper comes down here and empties in the Black Sea. The Volga comes down here and empties into the Caspian Sea. And you can see by here are the Urals separating the east steppes from the west steppes, and the Ukraine is a part of steppe lands by this definition, and these areas are the breadbaskets, particularly after the rich delta of the Dnieper and the Volga are drained, the breadbaskets. And we learn from Frankopan and Snyder, they are very clear on this, that World War I and World War II, central to war planning was the breadbaskets of the Volga and the Dnieper. And then this puts the roads in for us. I put it in here because there was some question early on. Wait a minute, is Kiev on the Silk Road? Well, it's a stretch. Okay, I grant you, it's a dotted line. Here's the Silk Road. This is a well-accepted map, and there, and you can see clear roads ending in the Black Sea, and it's just the Vikings taught everybody it was a hop, skip, and a jump, but particularly if you had the low draft boats to do it, to get from Kiev to the Black Sea. So this is all the rich trade of Krakow. And we'll go to the 10th century, and these Cumans, they were also known as the Kipchak, which isn't very helpful to have a lot of different names for the same people. They were Turkic, nomadic from the steppes. They involved themselves in politics, and they got into the Balkans by way of the Danube. And we're going to look at the Danube and the geography of that in just a second. They were culturally sophisticated, militarily powerful. And here they are first, before they really get to Ukraine. They're way up here on the steppes, the Kipchaks. At this time, you see that Crimea is divided. The Khazars are still hanging on to the northern part of Crimea, but the Byzantines are hanging on to the southern part of Crimea. It's not at all straightforward. So, but here come the Kipchaks, and they take over this part of the Ukraine just before the Mongols get there. And here they're integrating with the classical Greek population, the Italians, and other tribal peoples that have migrated up here from the Mediterranean. And note on here, Novgorod. Novgorod was where that statue was, and it was a cultural center when Kiev fell. When the Kievan Empire fell, they moved north, principalities of the Rus, but Novgorod became the first among equals. And if Putin is looking for the home of Russian culture, he could equally choose Novgorod. And so note, there is no Moscow. Moscow does not exist. Here come the Mongols, and that's when Moscow is going to find a reason to exist. And the Tatars collaborated with the Mongols, being a steppe people, at least partially a steppe people. And Moscow becomes a tax collector on the Moscow River for the Tatars. It was the Tatars that were given the responsibility to collect taxes from the Russians. So the Crimean Tatars continued as an ethnic, the largest ethnic population until the end of the 19th century. And after retaking Crimea from the Nazis in 1944, Stalin had suspected that the Tatars were collaborating, and he deported all of them to Uzbekistan, all of them, every last one, within a matter of 3 days, the textbooks say. So I'm thinking that is a pretty good place to stop. How are we doing on time?
3, almost 3.
Well, I could. There's a natural break point coming up, but I'm going to pause and take comments.
Don, and I think that's good. David Pepper here. Just in a prelude to the geography defining things, the one thing that this guy Tim Marshall talks about, I think you mentioned, Crimea was a warm water port, and some people argue that's why Russia is going for it again. But part of the reason it is such a key player in so much of this is because it's the land route to the north and it's the water route to the south. And if you look at the rest of where Russia touches the Black Sea, it's mountainous and not a good port. So this guy, Tim Marshall, really talks a lot about, the rivers coming down in there. It's a real good port, and that's what makes it so key. He does the same things for the mountains you define, the steppes, that sort of separate those two. He just says, you think about it, back then, they didn't have airplanes, and they were really defined by the rivers and the waterways. And you showed the the incursions by the Vikings as they came around over the waterways. So again, just that part of the way geography really defined the way geopolitics evolved, I think is important to keep in perspective.
Yeah, thank you, David. Homer.
Well, just sort of a question or comment somewhere in between. You alluded to Stalin's ethnically cleansing Tatars out of Crimea. Is that correct?
Yes.
Suspecting that they had supported the Nazis. Did the Cossacks not also? I remember the painted bird is about the atrocities committed by the Cossacks fighting for the Nazis at the end of World War II, and sort of nowhere to go, so they turned savage.
I don't doubt that, and there were some strong pro-Nazi sentiments during World War II, which were as much anti-Russian because of what Stalin had done with collective farms in Ukraine in the 30s, getting ready for World War II. I think an easy answer, Homer, is that Crimea was well defined, and you could scoop up that population from a well-defined territory, whereas the Cossacks, and when I continue next week, I've got a painting of the Cossack spirit. They're, like I say, they're the Minutemen, and they're a hell of a fighter, and they're horsemen, and there's still swampy areas where they were just hard to gather up. The Cossacks were always divided. I think the Crimeans were unified, and if their Khanate said we're going with the Nazis, everybody did. The Cossacks could never agree on anything, and I'm going to review that next week. The spirit of rebellion, and the Cossacks did go into an alliance with Moscow in 1653, but they were fickle allies, put it that way.
Look forward to next week.
Okay. Other questions, comments? Okay, so it's only 3:01. I've got.
Can I ask?
Yes.
I've raised my hand.
Yes.
I'm
Good.
a little confused as to what happened. You say Russia gained control of what is now Ukraine in 1862. Is that right?
No, Russia gained control of New Russia with Potemkin. The areas to the east of the Dnieper, and the areas to the west of that in 1862 were still Habsburg, were still Austro-Hungary. This gets very, very confusing because Ukraine has ill-defined borders that are changed every generation or so.
My memory of the map of New Russia was the Potemkin, and you say Potemkin was buried in Kherson, or so that area was west of the Dnieper, or arguably on the Dnieper.
Yeah.
And the map of New Russia seemed to extend quite a ways west of the Dnieper. But so I think, arguably, Russia had control from 1793 on for much of Ukraine.
Okay, we're going to get to more detail and more maps, and so we can put a pin in that assertion and re-examine it when we get to those maps. Where the border has been of the sphere of influence of Poland, Lithuania Commonwealth, which then merged with the Habsburgs, where that line has been waxes and wanes with civil wars, out and out national wars, and we'll follow along with that. Maybe I'll try to sketch a progressive map of the westward reach of Russian influence. For Potemkin, I'd put it at the Dnieper, but I'm sure there were pockets of what's called New Russia and Old Russia. So I think Moscow refers to everything east of the Dnieper as Old Russia, and areas to the west of the Dnieper as New Russia. And they've always had an ambition to expand New Russia. So I'm sure there was some waxing and waning there, but I'll stick with that answer. To be modified as we go.
Yeah, and I would again, just geography defining things. A river often was a defining line, because if you had an army, getting an army across the river was a big deal. You couldn't just take the bridge.
Yeah.
No
Yeah.
bridge.
Yeah.
Right. Well, that's, I mean, the Rhine River, the Volga, all these rivers were major barriers, in history.
Yeah, and what I'd like to point out, and it's coming up, is the Danube. When we get to the Crimean War, we'll see the Danube being the dividing line between the Balkans and everything south of the Danube was the Balkans. North of is not the Balkans. So yeah, rivers are important. The only other comment I'd make, and it's very interesting. When we were in Berlin, they had an exhibition called Die Deutsche und die Russen, and the very first stop was early trade routes between Novgorod and Regensburg. And we go, what? We'd been to Regensburg. How is that possible? And it was a mystery to me for a long time, until I became familiar with the geography of the Black Sea. The Danube empties into the Black Sea. And I think this is actually it, right here.
Is it in fact the boundary between Romania and Bulgaria?
Yeah, it's a boundary between a lot of things. So what I think happened with the trade between Novgorod, and this would have been around the year 1100, is flatboats going down the Black Sea and then up the Danube. As we've gone through history, which started really with Karin's brother, I've just been impressed how important trade has been in determining communication links and development of culture. And we were looking for that because Karin's brother is going to be a hotshot businessman, if he's not already. He's working for the largest cable company in the world, and is now centered in Dusseldorf. But he's going to be with us for our December 20th? December 20th session. And he's going to do a show and tell based on some of the things that we talked about, starting with COVID, he asked the question foolishly at the beginning of COVID, Dr. John, can you explain to me what a civilization is? He's in Bogota and I'm here, and we start Zooming every week, and that's the genesis of this fine tradition. And so he's been in Dusseldorf now for what, 6 months? And has visited all the historic sites that he could find, and many of which we talked about on Zoom during the early days of COVID. So he's going to do a show and tell. He already did a show and tell on a lake in Colombia that has battery, that has gold treasures at the bottom of it. So this will be his second show and tell. So mark your calendars. Okay, I think I filibustered my way to a suitable stopping point. So Jim, did you have your hand up again, or have you just forgotten to take it down? I guess he forgot to take it down.
Well, that's Carol. Carol.
Oh, Carol, I'm sorry. Carol.
This was such a packed synopsis of really synthesizing all these different sources. Thank you so much, John. This is really fantastic. Now I have to listen to it 3 or 4 more times so I make sure I get it all.
Thank you for that feedback, Carol.
Bye.
Carol is
Have a good.
also turbocharged our sessions when she brought in a group of us that also attended Ramsey's evening sessions. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
All right, folks.
All right,
Happy
thanks, John.
Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Bye.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye,
Yeah.
Barbara.
Thanks, John.
You betcha.
Bye, Homer.
Bye.
Bye, Homer. Hey, Homer, I was glad that you were so eager for this session that you tuned in on Monday.
Yeah, thank you for that kind interpretation. By the way, we have the most generous crop of persimmons ever.
Oh.
Would like to get them to you.
Oh, boy.
You
Well,
would like, we think we remember Iko wanting persimmons, is that right?
yeah,
Always.
yeah.
We might have picked 300 persimmons from one tree.
Oh,
And-
well, you're competing with my mother's persimmon tree. She said she could picked about 300 and something.
Well, do you still want them?
Yes.
Oh, well, but if it's easy to get it to us, I mean, if somebody's coming out this way, or you can keep it until we, see each other, because they keep quite a while.
Are you coming this way?
Unfortunately, we are going south for Christmas.
For Christmas. So I want to get them to you before then.
Yeah.
Ginny will be in touch.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye-bye, Homer.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for coming.